Fern, we've both been talking about morality and evolution and science, and you talk about it from the point of view of an atheist, and you're quite overt about that. Do you think that makes any difference to how you see the debate about evolution and science?
I think that, interestingly enough, given that we share dissimilar positions in terms of our belief or non-belief in a deity, actually we share very similar positions on both morality and the kind of the boundaries of scientific knowledge. So in terms of morality, I struggle myself, even though obviously I can't have the recourse to a kind of a God in terms of absolute moral values. I do think there are some form of moral truths, and that these are something that we can't understand or experience through scientific research. So I entirely agree on that, even though obviously I see that from a scientifically, methodologically naturalist perspective, and also a metaphysically naturalist perspective. I still think that there are moral truths.
I mean, I enjoyed your talk very much, but I wonder what you mean by calling that a naturalist perspective, because if you say there are moral truths and they're not subject to scientific investigation, that means there are truths which are not natural in the, or how are you going to use the word natural then, because it's wider than scientific?
And again, actually, I agree with you. I think this is it's a problem of labels. It's really difficult to categorise ourselves. It's difficult for me to categorise myself because I'm a philosopher who's an atheist who talks about evolutionary theory. Now, I have to be really careful because I have to say, obviously I accept methodological naturalism within evolutionary theory. I don't think there's any supernatural processes in evolutionary theory at all. When it comes to quantum mechanics or moral truths, obviously they are outside of the natural laws of what we can observe. But I'm not moving away from the naturalism, because I would see the naturalism as a way of categorising not just the kind of physical space that we're within, but the fact that I'm moving away from a belief system, which is a belief in a God. So I think really the problem that we're hitting against is that philosophically I've got to be an agnostic, because that's a philosophically stronger position for me. There are certain things I cannot know. But my atheism, that's a belief system. So I think the thorny issue in terms of how I use naturalism is actually in relation to the fact that I'm conflating my belief system with my philosophical stance.
Yeah. Maybe it's an interesting part of British culture at this time, that the boundaries between theism and atheism are actually not as rigid and well defined as some people like to say they are. And I think we have a common intellectual, not personal anyway, in Richard Dawkins, who holds that there's a huge gap, and that religion is bound to conflict with science, so you couldn't believe in God and have a naturalistic attitude. Whereas we both think, don't we, that you could and that you should, actually.
I think that part of the problem also is that there's a real issue with atheistic or non-believing identities because of the work that Richard Dawkins has done, because he's set a very kind of small box for us to reside in, which is a very hardline version of atheism. There are a lot of people who have very different perspectives on what atheism means. So I think Percy Bysshe Shelley, for example, would describe himself as an atheist, but believed in ghosts. So I mean, there's a lot of contradictions. And it's not as easy as we like to think to just put a box over here saying atheist and a box over here saying theist. So there's a lot of overlap between the two. And actually, because we tend to focus on the polar extremes, which are minority perspectives, we forget that in the middle there's all of these kind of majority of people who have very, very different and sophisticated ways of negotiating these different discourses.
That's right. And that's what I think religiously. I mean, I'm very familiar with the fact that in the average church congregation, and I speak from experience, not from technical sociology, but you get people with all sorts of views, and in fact they all go along and they just don't mention it if they're going to upset people what they actually think, but they think loads of different things, and the way you set questions to them will govern what they say, which might predetermine them saying something you wouldn't say to somebody else or in a different context.
Entirely.
And that's part of your research project, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, we're really trying to understand, because very little research has been done at all into public perceptions of the relationship between science and religion, and in particular evolutionary theory and creationism. And what we want to understand is the real lived experience, so how people really do encounter this issue in their day-to-day lives, and how that relates to the way that we're told to think about it by people like Richard Dawkins and other experts on platforms. I think one of the things that we've got to remember, and without going down a culturally relativistic route, because obviously, as I said earlier, I do accept the notion that there is an idea of a moral truth, and I do accept the notion of objective knowledge within the sciences. I think we have to recognise, when we look at the kind of the social milieu, there are probably as many different definitions of atheism as there are atheists. And ditto, there are probably as many different definitions of Christianity as there are Christians.
Yeah. So we can agree about most things quite amicably, and find no difficulty at all in the possibility of somebody rationally believing or not believing in a religious faith and having a good, straightforward evolutionary perspective as well.
Indeed, I think that the one thing that we have between us is that I recognise that my truth claim that there is no God is just as valid as your truth claim that you think there's a God. So,
I agree with you. If what you mean by valid is can be reasoned just as well.
Yes, indeed. So
just has to be false.
We can, but we can agree to disagree.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I think on that we should
Thanks,
shake.